We acknowledge the Yuggera and Kaurna nations as traditional custodians of the land on which we work, live and learn, and their continuing connection with the land, waters and community. We pay our respects to them and their elders past and present.
All content related to this program is for general informational purposes only and contains stories and discussion around mental health that may be disturbing to some listeners. If you are concerned about yourself or someone you know, please seek professional and individual advice and support. More details are contained in our show notes.
Depression! Looking for depression.
Yep, that's me, Dr. Toxic Positivity.
Come through, depression. How are you?
Oh, well, I'm feeling depressed. I want to get some help.
So you're feeling a little bit down. Hey, maybe it's just some fatigue.
Yeah, all of that.
You don't look depressed.
Well, I've been hiding things for a long time, and sometimes I go to bed on Friday and don't get up again until Monday morning, and so I was hoping to get a mental health plan.
You're just tired. I can see you're a busy bee most of the time, and everybody has bad days occasionally. Hey, why don't you go away and have a think about this and then come back another time if you're really depressed?
But...
No. Sometimes we just need a good lie down and a good think about things.
Well, that's my problem. I think I think too much.
Have you tried not thinking about it? Sometimes when we get some perspective, we realise that other people do have it worse than us. What time did you have your last coffee?
Oh, I don't know, sometime in the afternoon.
So that could account for your poor sleep. Try cutting your coffee intake from midday. That should fix it.
I don't know if that's the problem, really.
Why, has something happened to make you sad?
No.
I want you to take this home and read through these tips to help you out.
Turn that frown upside down. Go for a walk and loosen things up. I don't need extra attention because I fine just the way I am. I love turning in early and getting a good night's sleep. I don't feel like any of this is going to help.
Well, maybe that's where the trouble lies. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. How about you go home and put on something that brings your mood up? Spend the weekend watching some good comedies, and if you're still feeling a bit sad this time next week, well, book back in and we can go from there.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Have a lovely day.
Depression is complex. Sometimes it helps to talk. Other times that's the last thing we want to do.
The worst place to be is to feel like you can't talk to anyone about anything, and there are no options to get out of the chamber. I'm Louise.
And I'm Andy. And this is Reframe of Mind.
The podcast that cuts through the platitudes and gets to the core of living authentically, challenging our assumptions and improving mental health with the guidance of good science, philosophy and learning from other people's lived experiences.
In this episode, we unpack some of our own experiences alongside professional insights from Associate Professor Kimberley Norris, School of Psychological Sciences, University of Tasmania.
And Dr. Lisa Saulsman, clinical psychologist and senior lecturer at the School of Psychological Science, University of Western Australia.
One of the common things toxic positivity will usually try to tell us is there's always someone who has it worse off, right?
Last time on Reframe of Mind, we met Dr. Dinesh Palapana, who became a quadriplegic after a car accident when he was studying medicine.
Surely a spinal cord injury has to be more debilitating than depression, says toxic positivity. But what does Dinesh think?
It's something that I often reflect on and share. And that is, I have quadriplegia now. So my body is very different and it might change the things I do. But depression was far more debilitating than the spinal cord injury ever has been. Because I think when you're a prisoner of your mind, when you can't get out of your own head and you're stuck, like I've got a friend going through it right now, and it's so debilitating for her. She's just, she's struggling at work and whatever else. So I think when you have your mind, you can be more powerful than ever and you can do anything. I've had the benefit of being able to compare both experiences. And I can safely say that depression is far more debilitating than spinal cord injury has been.
Dr. Happy from the Happiness Institute helps us to understand some nuances when talking around the subject of depression.
I was thinking around the concept of longevity with happiness and good feelings and so forth. And I thought, okay, well, if we look at the example on the negative side of sadness versus depression, could we equate depression as something like a climate, whereas sadness would be an emotion like the weather within that climate? Or is that really something that's too simplistic? Because we don't really want to go around telling people just to be happy. We want to be able to help them to get through whatever they need to get through to resolve any kind of depressive feelings they may have.
So that's a great analogy. It's a very useful concept, and it is very similar to one that's been used in psychology in different ways for some time now. So in psychology, what we can talk about, if I just use those emotions, is the difference between depression or sadness as a mood, which, as you said, is something we all experience. I mean, you wouldn't be human if you hadn't been sad for at least some time, or experience some loss, some grief or whatever. So these are normal human emotions, which hopefully for most people will come and go. So depression is a mood like that versus what we might technically call major depressive disorder, which is a formal psychological diagnosis. And at the risk of oversimplifying, one of the differences is that a major depressive disorder is prolonged. So it goes on for not just a few minutes or a few hours or even a few days, but for a few weeks. And that's the important differentiator. So that's when, it is more complicated than that, and we can come back to it if you want, but that's the difference between what we might say is quote unquote normal forms of depression or sadness and quote unquote abnormal or dysfunctional forms, where it's lasted for more than 2 weeks, where it's significantly impacting on your ability to function, where it's impacting on your ability to work or socialize or whatever, where it's affecting your concentration and your mood and your appetite and other things as well. So yes, in a way that's a bit like, the fact that it's a bit cloudy today doesn't necessarily mean we're entering the next ice age.
So, Andy, we did promise that we were revealing all the vulnerabilities in this podcast, right?
We are, yeah. Warts and all.
Well, here comes some warts. Let's talk depression. Let's get down and dirty with it and talk about the thing that people don't want to talk about.
So it sounds like it might be really easy for us to talk about what we're talking about through this series and the stories that we're recounting. But, it comes off the back of months of our own therapy Tuesdays. We we joke about it now, and we even joked about it a bit in between as well, but we did a lot of processing while we were editing these interviews together, the first pass-through edits, for example. But then we thought, okay, well, now we're good to go. But then we started getting all the grabs out. It was like, oh my God, more trauma.
Not to mention the trauma when we were doing the interviews.
Oh my God. Which you'll hear in the interviews.
I think I actually am sitting here now feeling like I'm not depressed today. And
we can be grateful for that.
And that's a very good thing. I'm very happy to not be depressed today. I'm very happy that my last little DSM score came back as only mild and not severe. But it also leaves me feeling a little bit like an imposter. Who am I to talk about depression now that I'm not depressed, not in the middle of it as badly as I was in the last year? And I think that really speaks to the way that we are used to people talking about depression. When we hear stories, they're always picked up from the worst possible place. It's that tragedy porn, the drone starts and someone is in the worst moment of their life.
Yep.
And then they talk about...
And they're right back in that moment.
Yeah. I don't want to be right back in that moment though.
No thanks. I'm very happy to share what we've been through. And, there may be times throughout this series that we do actually get triggered by one thing or another as we hop back into the story or start processing things again. But I'm really happy that we're not there at this moment as we're recording this.
I couldn't talk about feeling depressed for so long. I couldn't talk about the fact that I was depressed for so long. Probably took me about 5 or 10 sessions with my current psychologist before I actually started to really open up about the fact that I was afraid to be depressed. I was afraid of those negative emotions. And I think you would have seen in our conversations every day how, the extent of what depression has been like for me over my life.
Which we will get into during the series as well. That's all the good stuff to come.
Oh,
but but Yeah, definitely. Like I've been on this journey with you for about a year now, and a lot of stuff we've thrown about and tossed about and almost been each other's shoulder and rock and what have you along the way. Because Free therapy. You know, where else do you get the benefit of recording an interview with a professional who specialises in psychological services and then go, actually, well, this is how it applies to me, with someone you trust you can have a chat to that isn't going to jump in and tell you you're wrong and isn't going to try and fix it for you, but just lets you explore it. And that ultimately, I think, is what we're trying to create here for anybody else that, you know, might want to use it that way as well. This is our experience of these things, and everybody will have their own experience of it.
So why don't we start a year ago then, when we're first launching Welcome Change Media, which is the business that we've started together, Andy. You know, I started to see this psychologist that I'm seeing now just after, I think it was, that I left my previous job. Not long before that, I recognised that my depression was really bad, and I'd gone to see the GP and I'd got the mental health plan. It wasn't until after I left that job that I was able to finally get in with a psychologist and really go through a lot of things. So by the time I met her, that depression was not great. Not that it's ever great, but it was quite bad.
And yet you were still using some pretty effective masks, I have to say.
What do you think I was?
Well, you know, I thought you were being with confidence when you said, let's make a podcast. I'm like, yeah.
You thought I knew what I was doing.
Well, my old boss from Darwin was contacting me saying, let's make something. I thought, yeah, this is awesome, which it is.
It is.
But it was completely different to the way the situation actually was.
Because you thought that I had all my shit figured out. Turns out I had no shit figured out. I'm sorry.
Well, as it turns out, I had enough shit of my own to figure out. So we were both in it together, warts and all.
When we started Welcome Change Media, I had already spent the last 6 months struggling with depression. I had trouble working on my worth. I had trouble working on my identity of who I was without the career that I'd worked 20 years for. 2 of my cats died within a month.
I remember that.
The thing is, though, that, and again, this is easier for me to talk about now with you, with Andy, with someone I trust, and with some distance from how I was feeling. But I realised that I had been experiencing rounds of depression throughout my entire life. And this round was the first round that I ever received medication for, because I thought that I could think my way out of all the others. I guess I couldn't, but I managed to run away from them and distract myself, but they all came back.
Yeah, I can relate to that as well, because I think for me, certainly earlier in my life as well, there were patches where I felt terribly depressed. Overall, my early adult life, in hindsight, looks like a roller coaster of internalised emotions that just ended up with binge drinking at parties or clubs.
Yeah.
And, you know, as we work on ourselves over the years and find things about ourselves that we learn to love, you know, like when I came out, things stabilised. You know, you would think that it would be quite tumultuous and would have its own problems, which it can. But for me, that actually was a bit of an affirmation for who I was, and I didn't have to hide that part of myself anymore. So that was a relief. And I think it would be fair to say that I learnt how to manage that after starting counselling. Like, talk therapy worked for me. I remember the very first time I saw a counsellor, it was after my first long-term relationship ended, about almost 20 years ago now. And I came out of that first session feeling amazing. And it wasn't because I was cured. It was because for an hour, someone had let me talk. And finally, I could say the things that I needed to say that were important to me, how I was feeling about things without feeling judged about it, without somebody trying to hop in and fix everything. I felt heard. I felt good that I could pay my money and I could get out of there, but I'd been heard.
I'm sorry I'll jump in on you before our hour's up, Andy, to share my own stories. But
sure
you're not paying me $170 an hour here, which is what I pay my psychologist. Probably a great deal, considering how many times I just get to go in and offload everything to her and then just walk away. Here you go.
It's almost like depression happens in patches for me. This is my experience. It might not be anybody else's, but something might happen or even not happen. But suddenly I'll notice that I'm in a low point. You know, I might have an episode today and then it might be years before I feel that way again now, or months. You know, at one point I was doing shift work for a security company and that led to a whole other build-up of anxiety, and that actually led to quite a sustained period of depression.
That's the thing about depression. Its cousin is anxiety, isn't it? Or maybe even its sister. Anxiety really does go hand in hand with depression. And that affects a lot of things. And I think one of the biggest things that I didn't realise until the last 12 months is how anxiety is not just a feeling, but it actually manifests in your body. It affects your chemistry. It affects the way that your body feels, the way that it reacts to things. Particularly, it affects your sleep. And then you get into that cycle where it's affected your sleep and your mind is running off with you and you're anxious, and then you can't really sleep. And then because you're getting a shitty sleep, you feel less able to take on the next day. And then the anxiety runs off with you thinking about that, and it
just
goes
keeps
around and
feeding
around.
on itself. Yeah, it snowballs.
So by the time we spoke to Associate Professor Kimberley Norris from the School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Tasmania, I was already taking sleeping medication. I'd tried a few different brands. Some of them didn't work. And I really wanted to find other sustainable, non-addictive options.
When you're lying there and you can't sleep, your brain starts ticking over. So it's tick, 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 thinking. But actually giving yourself permission during the day, and it might even be before bed, not too close, but maybe before bed. And we call it thinking time. Some people call it worry time. Some people call it working time. And essentially, I can just go to town for these next 10 to 20 minutes or so. I can just let my brain absolutely go to town with its thinking, its problem solving, its worrying. But then if it starts to happen any time outside that, so when we're lying in bed or perhaps when we're somewhere else where we don't want it to happen, we say, it's not thinking time right now. If it's still there when it's thinking time, sure, we'll indulge you then. But for now, we're not going to go there. And so you deliberately redirect yourself to thoughts that help you feel happy, things that you enjoy thinking about, rather than using it as a problem-solving time.
So does the body respond better then to messages of, trying to retrain with that internal voice, or does it respond better to things like muscle stretching, the aromatherapy, the other senses when we're trying to retrain ourselves?
Ideally, it's actually a combination of both that internal voice as well as those physical approaches, because the brain has a really strong connection with the body and they speak to each other all the time. So if you actually act on both at the same time, you're literally those new neural pathways you're building in your brain, which actually underpin patterns of behaviour. They underpin routines and rhythms. They actually build much more quickly and are reinforced more strongly when they're getting multiple sensory input. So when it's your internal voice as well as your actions, they build together, and over time, this neural pathway builds, and the more we use it, the stronger it becomes. And that's actually why you never break a habit as an adult, because you literally have a neural pathway in your brain for that habit, and we instead replace them, which literally means building a new, more preferable neural pathway in your brain that becomes the dominant pattern.
How long does it take to build a new pathway?
Depends on how complex the behaviour is. More simple behaviours can be achieved, quite quickly. More complex behaviours can take weeks. But the idea is the more often you activate this neural structure, the more often you activate this pathway, the more energy, literally, the more energy you're sending to it to grow.
I really like the idea of scheduling my anxiety time so it doesn't take up the whole day.
Yes.
So go, no, we save that for after 6 when it comes up.
That's right.
We save that for later.
After dessert.
Yes, we have that one later on tonight. So I kind of wonder then how we would create that as a pathway. That's done through routine then, obviously. So backing it up with the internal voice and the external actions, if I wanted to do something like create a specific time of the day where all I do is dump all my anxieties in and then close that box after the timer goes off, is that the technique to do that? To just keep doing it until it fits?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And after a while, what you notice is you won't even have to have that deliberate, oh, no, it's not that time yet, because your brain will automatically go, it's not that time yet. And so it will give you that ability, as you say, through pattern, through routine, to actually have greater control. And, during that worry time, like you say, go to town, have fun.
Have fun thinking of the worst case scenarios.
Exactly. And the fun part is, like you said, at the end, you close that lid and say, thanks for that. You can stay there now.
And then afterwards, I suppose once that pathway is built, I could build another pathway on top of that says, let's just bypass that worry box altogether.
Well, eventually what you can do is learn how to use that worry time to actually conquer the worries. So rather than just containing them, you then conquer them. And that takes a little bit longer and employs strategies like cognitive restructuring, which is essentially where we train your brain to think in a different way about your worry. But it's a very, very effective way. And as you say, eventually, the big worries that don't really have to be worries, that occupy your time but really don't achieve anything, they will go. But worry will still be part of everybody's life because it's normal and it actually helps keep us safe. But it's when it gets too much, too often, that we want to turn the dial down and get on top of it.
From a more mundane level as well, I'm thinking this could have some really practical uses. I mean, we all have to do our housework, right? So if we can use that time to work on things creatively in our thoughts, or to actually use our thoughts in ways other than, geez, I hate cleaning the bath.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
The same principle. That's exactly it. The same principle. So, and it could be, well, I have to clean the bath, so I may as well use this as a time to listen to that audio book that I never get to, or to turn up my favourite music, or to, work out, or suddenly, as you say, changing the thinking around the action actually changes the mood around the action.
I think I just found some motivation to iron those shirts.
I think I just found a whole new way to look at the housework. That's so instead of hating it, I could combine all the things that I hate in with my newfound anxiety time. Let's just do it all at once.
Well, fundamentally what we're talking about is something that we've known for quite some time, which is the way we think affects the way we feel, and the way we feel affects the way we act. So if we can, press on any one of those three components, we will affect change in the others.
What if when the component is, I know we do kind of have a jokey tone about the anxiety, but sometimes it's worse than others. Sometimes it's paralyzing. So
absolutely.
What about when it's extreme? And even when it comes to depression, it's also, I've felt that in ways where it is just, you just can't get up. So how do we kind of start to build those new pathways when it's more extreme? Same process?
And it's a similar one, but as you've indicated, it's much more challenging because, for example, when you are literally paralysed by your anxiety, we actually know that that it's very hard to think straight, let alone do these things. So what we'd actually say is when you're in those really critically high levels of anxiety, the first thing to do is to focus on the physical. So focus on getting back in control of slow, deep breathing, because what happens is that will slow our heart rate down, which will then start to send a message to our brain, it's okay, you are safe. As our heart rate slows down, we can also, if we release some of the tension in our body, and even people who don't suffer from extreme anxiety do hold their anxiety in a certain part of their body. For some people, it's their shoulders. For some people, it's their forehead. For some people, it's their chest. It can be anywhere. But learn where it is in you and spot release that through breathing and imagining that space becoming open and relaxed. As your anxiety will actually slowly come down. That's a bit of a Band-Aid, if you like. And it will slowly come down just enough to start to think a little bit more clearly. And that's when you're going to be more able to introduce these routines. And also, I think in those instances, most people would also benefit from getting some specialised support to learn more focused and targeted strategies on their thoughts and their feelings and their body's reactions so that they feel more in control. Because that's the thing about anxiety, essentially, is when we feel the world is unsafe and that things are out of our control. So bringing down the anxiety is actually the first thing. And we can't do that with thought when we're in those really, really high-level states. We actually need to start with the body. Similarly with depression, when we're in those very, very low states, what we actually need to do is to try and increase our energy, which of course our brain is saying, I don't want to, I can't. And our fatigue that often goes along with depressive episodes makes it very challenging. So for people with depression and depressive episodes, having a pre-prepared routine where they don't even have to think about what should I do, it's already there. And part of that routine is about recognising that most actions that many people without this condition take for granted are actually lots of smaller actions. So the example I often use, if you all think about for a moment, how many steps are there in putting on a load of washing? So just try and calculate how many there might be. So there's quite a few, and people, depending on how diligent they are with their washing, I guess, it can be anywhere upwards of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 odd steps. Now, if you are somebody who's experiencing a depressive episode, 8 steps is probably a lot more than you can do in one hit.
I was just thinking.
So instead,
overwhelming.
That's it.
Overwhelming.
Exactly. And that's what your brain says. It says, I can't do all of that, so I won't. So instead you say, okay, I know I can't do all of that, and that's okay. So I'm going to do step 1, which is to collect the items that need to go to the laundry. And if I do that, guess what? I've achieved something. And if I've achieved something, I need to recognise I've done that. And sometimes that's where it stops, but it doesn't matter because you've still achieved. Sometimes you'll go, well, I can't do any more, but tomorrow I don't have to do that first step. I can go to the second step, which will be to sort them into their relative piles. And so suddenly the idea is, rather than being completely overwhelmed, because this is a lot to do, it's about recognising I don't have to do all or nothing. I can take steps in between, and every step I take is an achievement.
I love how you said that you can't think yourself out of feeling this way. I wonder what is going on chemically in the body that is stopping that, because I've found personally you can't think yourself out of those moments. Absolutely. So no. Are there processes going on that is working against you so that you can't do that? That would be knowledge that would be helpful for people to have.
Everybody who experiences those high levels of distress that go along with all sorts of conditions, which obviously are not limited to anxiety and depression, but we'll use them as an example. The neurochemicals in your brain literally are not in balance. They've literally become out of balance. And once your brain's neurochemicals are out of balance, your ability for the brain to work in the way it should is also out of balance. So it is literally impossible for your brain to work the way you want it to when it doesn't have the chemicals it needs to. So generally speaking, when we're talking about depression, for example, it's we have too little of certain chemicals such as serotonin, or too little of chemicals like dopamine, which is, if you like, your little feel-good chemical. And so it's not that people aren't trying, it's literally that the chemicals in their brain won't let them think their way out of it. And that's why types of therapy can be really useful, because some therapies can assist in recalibrating that balance. But it's also why for some people, medication will be a genuine necessity, because it is the only way to get those chemicals back in balance and get the brain working the way we would like it to.
I know this is turning into my personal therapy session, but I was going to say, and that's exactly the same. Like, that's the situation. I would have for years thought, I can't take medication. I should be able to think my way out of this. This is not, no matter how many depressive or anxiety related states that I've had over my lifetime, until the last one where my doctor recognized that and said, look, let's try this. And I finally said yes. And then by taking SSRIs, it helped to balance that so that I could start to think around that. I kind of like to speak to people about normalizing medication and not having a stigma around it, because it doesn't solve the problem, but it certainly helps, gives you the space to solve the problem.
I love the way you put that, because that's the exact way I speak to my clients about this, that essentially it gives you a buffer zone. It gives you that little bit of space to breathe so that you can then start doing those other strategies that help you longer term to get on top of these things.
More from Kimberley later, but let's just hit the pause button for a sec and talk about medication and depression in general and how we've had a dance with that throughout our lives.
I've had a lot of experiences of depression that I've really only come to realise have been so bad since taking medication, because I, for years, have said, no, I don't need medication. I can think my way out of this. I thought my way into it. I should be able to fix this. And I was fighting my own body chemistry. There's been stigma around medication, certainly.
I can attest to that. I've lived it.
Yeah.
I have experiences from my 20s when it was suggested that medication might or might not be a good way to go, depending on who I spoke to.
I've had it suggested that I couldn't possibly go on medication for depression because it'll make me gain more weight.
Well, like I had somebody say, well, you don't want to go on to any kind of medication because it's all addictive and you'll never get off them. These are the sorts of things that come up with this stigmatised view of medication that actually really significantly helps people.
Yeah. Really can. And not all medication is going to be right for you. I mean, I feel like now I should be getting sponsored by a pharmaceutical company.
I was going to say, we're not actually sponsored by anybody in particular or at all, actually, around all of this medication talk. But I think it's worth having a conversation about because, I mean, to this day, I don't take medication for any depressive episodes or any anxiety or anything like that. And I'm quite fine today. As we sit here today, I'm fine. I'm not in that state. There's no need to start that drone or the sad music because
no trauma porn here.
No trauma porn today. But, tomorrow, the next day, sometime next week, I might get triggered by something. Something might make me feel bad again about myself.
And, I take SSRIs daily. I have done now for the last 18 months or so. I'd never taken them before that. My GP was lovely and said, are you willing to give this a try? It might help. And I said, okay, let's try it. We started off on a low dose with a brand that made me feel like every time I went to the toilet, I was going to shit my anus out. And
She paints a pretty picture.
I'm so sorry to all the colleagues that I worked with at the time that had to follow me into those cubicles. So that's not a great story about medication. But you know what? I went back to the doctor and I said, my stomach cannot handle this. What else can we do? And she's like, well, let's try a different ingredient. Let's switch brands. So we switched brands and that one worked a bit better. And then she's like, well, we reassess it in a few months. Is this helping more? Okay, well, if you're feeling like it's helping sometimes but not all times, then we can adjust the dose. It's a trial and error process that we've been through like that. And now the one that I take doesn't affect my gut in that way. The amount that I take seems to be enough for me to keep those SSRIs nice and happy in my head, and it gives me the space to not be so reactive to myself and those emotions, those feelings when they come up. And that's the beauty of medication. It's not all going to work first go, and it's not always going to be right for everybody, but I think that taking that stigma, reducing that stigma around it and talking about it as well is really important. Because when I started taking SSRIs, I didn't know anybody else that was, and this is 18 months ago.
Look, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if late 90s Andy had actually taken the prescription from the doctor. I was feeling particularly down at the time, and the reason I went to see a doctor about it was because I just couldn't shake it. I'd had episodes, I'd label them as episodes. I'd had periods before I felt down, but this was a long, protracted experience this time around. And I was looking through a photograph recently from that period of time, and what should have been a photograph of a normal happy day trip out with Dad on the 3801, which is like an old steam locomotive. The photo of me standing in the driver's cabin, I can see this day, like the expression on my face, I can see the emptiness. I felt empty inside. And so I went to the doctor and was saying how I was feeling and that I wanted someone to talk to. My line of inquiry was about trying to get some talk therapy, which in itself had its own stigmas back then. And I said, I don't want medication. I don't want to be on drugs. Because another friend who was on medication at the time said to me, look, you'll get addicted. They're not good for you. They'll do terrible things to your body. Any chance of me even considering medication at that point was far out the window. But the first thing the doctor did was write a script. So I didn't feel like I'd been listened to. So I tore it up.
Yeah.
I think within that as well, there was a feeling that, okay, well, I might be feeling this way, but it's nowhere near as bad as what that person's going through, because this is happening to them as a result and that's happening to them. Whereas, me, I'm holding down jobs, I'm doing all the normal stuff and successfully getting through life.
And our character from the Angsties, depression.
Yeah.
Actually, also
Familiar.
our character from the first of the episode here, where he goes into the doctors.
Yeah,
Based on a true story, the first time I tried to get help, actually about 4 years ago, when I went to see a GP, and then they said to me, maybe you just feel down today, you don't look depressed. And I walked out and then, didn't see a different one till 3 years later. So that stereotype of depression and what somebody with depression looks like is not right. It's not the sad sack on the couch that won't get up and can't do anything and sits around in the house crying all the time. I mean, it could be, but it's also the highly successful person that works with you, that goes to work and puts on a mask and pretends to be all these things and then spends the night crying in bed or just not feeling like connecting with the world.
And look, we've had a conversation about our own tone as we're recording these episodes, and, the most common way to present some of the stories that we're telling would be to cue music, put in the drone. Are you crying yet? Do I need to ask you another personal question to make you, a bit more emotional?
Yeah.
We see it on TV all the time with these stories. And, to me, it feels like an extension of that toxic positivity narrative, because inevitably there's that ray of hope at the end, or that moment of where the struggle has been overcome and they're an inspiration and, the happy piano starts and all of that bullshit, but we don't need to do that, because the one thing we said we want to do when we're making this is be authentic. Right now, I don't feel like that, and I don't want to go back into that state to recall those stories. I can talk about that, how I was feeling on that day, and remember it, but I don't have to get myself back into that state to make people aware that that's how I actually felt.
I don't feel like that today either. But we were originally going to record this episode a couple of days ago. And the first time we were going to record this episode, something had happened in my day that triggered an anxiety attack so bad that I just said, Andy, I can't do this. And I went back to bed.
Yep.
So even though a part of me is sitting here so used to, after 20 years in media, presenting stories in that way that you're describing, let's get to the crux of it. Let's get them to cry. Let's make them tell that story and hook them in with the emotion. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, should I be crying when I'm telling the stories of feeling suicidal? Should I be crying when I'm talking about the darkest moments in my life? But the answer is today I don't feel like that. Today I don't feel like it's the worst day of my life. Today I feel like there's things to live for and things to look forward to. Last week it was shit.
And my violin skills aren't that good yet, so...
The thing with this is that today I feel great. And today you feel great, and we're recording this thing and we're wondering, should we be, down in the trenches, down in the gutter, in our heartbreak, sharing those stories from that place of feeling. But could we even do that anyway? Because I wasn't in a place to record on Anxiety Day last week. What would you have done? Gone for the live interview in the shower with me when I was sitting on the floor crying?
That's right. Just protect the mic. Don't get the mic wet. The water's hitting the mic. Can you just kind of just angle yourself a bit to the left? That's better. Yeah. The one thing I can say today is that I do carry a little bit of anxiety. So it's not bringing me down to the point of depression, but the thing that I am anxious about right at the beginning of this series as we're recording it is that I'm sharing a lot of personal stories throughout the series. And the one thing that I am very anxious about amongst that is that I might say something that is going to, upset in some way or offend or make somebody feel bad.
Yeah.
Because there's a possibility that somebody might hear something along the way and think, oh, that's me. And that's not my intention at all. In fact, I'm doing everything I can to take any kind of identity away from anybody with anything I talk about. But that is a point of anxiety for me as we go forward with this. And it's only as we keep talking about these things, and I can see clearly I'm not actually, all I'm doing is making myself look like the one who's got the problem, you know what I mean? And even the way I language that, that's kind of a manifestation of where I've been through in life and what I've come to expect of myself because of things that have been said to me over the years by significant people in my life. And that's me. I took that on. It's now up to me to sit with that anxiety as I actually have this point of reckoning and heal it.
So is there value in going over the old stories? We've written a big page here. Literally in front of us, we have notes here about the times, plural, that I felt suicidal. And I'm actually just wondering if there's any point to going over those, except to pull out the parts that are relevant to now. Is there a point to retelling those stories?
Well, here's my take on that, my hot take.
Here's your hot take.
Here's my hot take. And it's a bit of a journey, because, my analogy is how they go. I've got this kind of theory about pop culture, right? So think back to, neither of us were alive, so it's going to take a bit of imagination, but think back to a time back in the 1940s, 1950s.
I'm thinking back to my past life,
Colonial Australia.
Well,
we were a federation, but, very much still tied to the Empire of England, and how important or how highly regarded the royal family were. They were the celebrities of the day. If you wanted somebody to look up to, it was a royal. So skip forward half a century and suddenly we've got the Kardashians, we've got all these other famous types. Whatever generation, we all have our own celebrities that we've followed, but it's kind of struck me that the reason that people probably follow these people or take so much interest in their lives the way they do is because they want to know that they're not the only ones feeling like this. They want to know that that person that they're looking at, that big Hollywood person, is capable of feeling just as bad as I'm feeling today. And so when something salacious comes out about them, about their divorce or about an affair they've had or something like that, it suddenly makes them normal. It brings them down to a relatable level. And it's not so much that, okay, well, that means I can get up to that kind of level, but it means that that person who is so successful and has got such reach is actually no different to me. That's common ground.
Yeah.
And so I do think there's value in sharing those stories, because when I've heard stories similar to this in different seminars I've been to, for example, some of them, the speakers have still been very close to the subject matter and have actually become emotional. Others, they've lived it, they've learned from it, and they're recounting it and are able to express in detail what that experience has been, but it doesn't actually affect them emotionally anymore, and that's okay too. That's actually probably preferable, because it shows me that it's possible to get through that level of shit and be okay.
Well, can I tell you about the first time I noticed that my depression was really bad?
Yeah.
I was around about, I think, 21, 22. I lived in Canberra at the time. I had only recently moved there to work in TV, and I wasn't coping with I was working shift work. I suppose I felt isolated. I don't know exactly what the catalyst was for me feeling the way that I felt, but I do know that all things start with the floor of the shower. All my stories have the shower in them. There's something about sitting under running water that gives me time to think, I suspect. So I'm on the floor of the shower, blade in hand, and I'm asking myself, why bother? I actually, when I say I lived in Canberra, I lived outside of Canberra on a farm. And so I was aware that my tank water was, getting lower and lower as I was in there for about an hour. I think it wasn't until the hot water ran out. I got up off the floor and I asked myself, when was the last time that I was truly happy? And I remembered my time back then. Before I lived in Canberra, I went to uni in Wagga, and I used to volunteer at the community radio station there. And I said, you know what? I was last happy when I was on the radio. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that, and I'm going to see if that makes a difference. I didn't take any medication. What I did was get in my car and go for a really big drive, stop a couple of places, and wrote a list of things that I could do to get myself on the way to becoming a professional radio announcer, because then I thought I won't be depressed anymore if I can do that. And the next morning I was feeling better than I had been feeling for a long time. So I searched for courses. I volunteered at community radio stations. I even started driving up to Yass to present a radio show, and down to Tuggeranong for another show for a couple of nights a week. All while I was working full-time shift work and studying at a radio course at the Canberra Institute of Technology. Pretty much running myself into the ground. But I was feeling better because I was taking action. And then I got my first job in radio, in commercial radio.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, and I think this kind of notion of chasing happiness comes back into that, doesn't it?
Yes.
Like when I have this, I'll feel like that.
Yeah.
If I just do this, then I won't feel that way again. Like.
Oh yeah, don't mistake that story. That's not a story of and I did this and it all worked out for me. That is,
and she lived happily ever after.
That is not and I lived happily ever after. That is the prequel to how I tied my entire identity and happiness to a career that didn't work out.
Oh, yeah, the storm clouds were just forming off the coast.
That's the prequel to that. That's the prequel.
Well, look, like after I had a relationship breakup in the early 2000s, that's when I had another depressive episode because suddenly, I was in this house that we'd bought, only a few years prior. I was living our life. I was living it alone with all of our pets that we had.
Yeah.
And I was doing that solo, except, I might as well just had a cardboard figure there of my ex-partner because for all intents and purposes, I was just living the same life.
Yeah, just without them.
Exactly. It wasn't too long after I started seeing a counsellor and kind of trying to work through some stuff. But, in amongst all of that, I thought, okay, well, here's my chance to really find out who I am. I'm out there somewhere. Obviously, I've lost myself with all of this identity stuff. Go out and have a good drink. I'll go out and party. You're going to offer me that party drug to try? Yeah, I'll give that a go. I've never tried that before. I only live once. All that kind of stuff, I was, for the first time in my single life, in my newly single life, I was out of the closet. I'd gone fairly quickly into a relationship after I came out, which, was good for me. I'm good in a relationship. I feel a lot more stable, I think, and that's neither good nor bad. I don't think that's just how I feel.
Yeah.
But suddenly I was in party mode, I kind of felt like I'd grown up too early when I was a kid, like that I was expected to act mature, like if I was giggling away with friends, I'd be told to be quiet or, we're being too noisy, go away and play somewhere else. So, over all of those years, I learned to modify my behaviour to please others from a very young age. So, when all this happened, I wasn't suicidal, but I did see it as an opportunity to experience the things that I hadn't done before. All of those rites of passage that we speak about suddenly were available to me again, like I'll go out and have a kiss with someone, or I'll go out and whatever.
Why don't you tell him what it really says in the script? Andy's slutty, sexy fun times.
Well, it was Andy's slutty, sexy fun times, and I've got to say, it wasn't just for a few months. As a friend and I would say from time to time, I certainly got in touch with my inner whore, and did that make me happy? Well, it certainly created some fun, sexy times, but I don't know if it contributed to overall happiness, and certainly didn't put the cap on any depression I might have been feeling because, okay, in those moments I might have been having fun, but then I'd go home to my old life without the partner and feel just as lonely and just as low, and who knows when that next time would come again.
The sexy, slutty times that you experienced is actually an example, probably a bad example, but an example nevertheless of what's...
Well, I was acting unconsciously.
Clinical psychologist Lisa Saulsman has talked to us about. She's from the School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Western Australia, and she's a CBT expert. Would that kind of mean that every time I've experienced any kind of social anxiety that's had me going, I don't want to go out and see all these people, I should have actually just gone and saw those people or turned up to that event and not said I couldn't make it because I would have enjoyed it?
Absolutely, you've got absolutely, yeah. Unfortunately, yes, that's what I'm going to say. But yeah, so a lot of our emotions are going to drive us to withdraw, to isolate. So instead, how can we engage? How can we get active? Our emotions are going to tell us to avoid certain situations or people or doing certain things. How can we actually approach those things even though they feel challenging? Our emotions might tell us to procrastinate. How can we get started and make us start and do things? Our emotions might be telling us to neglect ourselves and our self-care and what have you. Instead, how can we actually do self-soothing things and really devote time to ourselves and self-care? Our emotions might be telling us to kind of lash out, be aggression, verbally or physically. How can we instead, have a bit of a time out, calm ourselves and come back and actually be assertive with the person that we want to interact with? So this idea of actually what the emotion might be driving us to do may be unhelpful, and what would be that opposite action. A big example of that is in depression, where the behaviour that the depression is telling us to do is to really isolate ourselves, withdraw, stay home, not see people, those sorts of things. And actually the treatment for depression is behavioural activation, to do the opposite of that. How do we re-engage, reactivate in our lives, get involved in things, different activities, different people? How do we slowly do that? So that principle of acting opposite to what the emotion is kind of guiding us to, as a way of moving forward from the emotion, I guess.
I was just going to ask that exact thing with depression, because that's like when I've experienced depression, that's one of the things. Cut myself off from people who are reaching out, who do want to, talk, because you think that you don't want to bring anybody else down. But then that's not helpful at all.
So that would be a great example of your mind saying, don't go out. You're just going to bring others down. You're just going to be a wet blanket. There's no point in doing this. So that would be that kind of mental preoccupation that's not helping you at that time, that needs to be kind of postponed, the sense of detaching from it in some way, not kind of getting caught in those thoughts, so that you can choose that, start to take small steps to that opposite action of getting involved and phoning a friend and having a chat or whatever that might be. So that's really hard when we're feeling depressed, but actually that's the most effective treatment for depression, is to actually do the opposite of what the depression is telling you to do.
It's not worry Wilma, that's depression Debbie.
Oh, yeah, I have miserable Murray. Oh, you don't want to know all the there's miserable Murray, there's ruminating Ruth, and there's planning Pam. Planning Pam is Wilma's twin sister, because Wilma likes to worry about things, so planning Pam comes in and just plans everything to the nth degree to sort of calm Wilma down, you see. So
who were these people that hurt you, that got the names? Where are the Ruths on the
It's just no, this doesn't refer to anyone in real life. I just like alliteration, that's all.
I think it is slightly off topic from what we were going to ask you, but this whole conversation has reminded me of a chat that we did with a person who was a police officer, and he was shot several times, and he said that the reason he survived that was because he'd actually done worst case scenario planning before he even decided to take that route with the police force. And I kind of wonder where's that difference between what he's describing in, looking at the worst case scenario and accepting that, he could get shot on the job and that is a genuine possibility, and planning for if that were to happen before it even happening, versus worrying about something like that happening.
That's a really good question. I think that's a tough question, because I work with a lot of people who are chronic worriers, and what we work on are what we call the positive beliefs they have about worry, the value they're going to get out of it by, mean that I've planned for everything and I'm prepared for everything and I can solve problems and those things that I mentioned before. And I guess I come from the position that worry is never a helpful thing. It's always a futile thing. And so we work in therapy about how we can start to shift our perspective on the value we get out of worry. But I think there's a difference between if there's a legitimate risk to that individual because of the profession that they're in, and so they've thought that risk through and how they've come to a level of acceptance about that, and how they would manage that, versus someone who on a chronic ongoing basis engages in this thought process for everything and anything. Do you know what I mean? So they're worrying about all sorts of things, and when that thing's resolved, another worry pops up about something else and another one, and they're constantly chasing their tail, worrying about all sorts of things. So I think there's a difference between having isolated a specific thing that someone needs to feel they have a plan with and a level of acceptance with, versus it being a chronic, I guess, an ongoing coping style for what I would say trying to cope with uncertainty. And I think all of us have a lot of difficulty tolerating uncertainty, and we can use worry as a way of trying to feel like we've achieved a degree of certainty about situations that are uncertain.
So is it kind of like trying to do, I suppose for want of a better term, like a bit of a reality check, to think of a far less dangerous situation, me with the laundry and procrastinating and not being motivated to do the laundry. One day I just timed myself doing certain components of it, and suddenly it's not an issue. Do we tend to kind of make pictures in our mind that are much larger and then stop us or paralyse us from moving forward?
Yeah, well, I guess, with anxiety, for example, the big things that we're doing in our mind with anxiety is we're overestimating kind of the threat or the danger or how bad something's going to be, and we're underestimating our ability to cope. So one of the things is, trying to find ways to bring perspective to that. Is it really that likely that this bad thing's going to happen? Are the consequences really going to be as awful as you think? And are you really not going to be able to cope with it? And that's like a key question you might ask. What could you do to cope should things not go well, for example? So I think Yes, so to a certain extent, it is really useful to have ways that we can have that reality check, that we can, this magnified kind of overestimation of threat and underestimation of coping, how we can kind of bring perspective to that. And I think, what you've described is a little kind of what I might call a behavioural experiment, which is actually, getting the facts, timing how long it actually takes to do these things, and how does that match up with your prediction of how awful it's going to be. So that's a bit of corrective kind of feedback to bring perspective to that.
Don't get me wrong, it's not something I actually look forward to as a treat during my week, but it's not something that I actually worry about anymore when I go about my business. It's just something I do in between. So it's kind of helped to even that out, I suppose.
But I guess also, instead of avoiding those things, by reassessing what it actually means to do it and the practicalities of that, and then actually doing it, shows that although you don't enjoy it, it's something that's tolerable, it's manageable, and I guess what the consequences are, the positive consequences of not continuing to procrastinate on it as well.
Well, I think the benefit of actually not having 3 loads of washing to fold on a weekend far outweighed doing it during the week. So, yeah.
And I will say that after we did speak to Derek about his worst case scenario planning, as a constant anxiety sufferer myself, I actually started to look at what is the worst case scenario of this thing if this thing was to happen, and it kind of took the power out of it, knowing that I could cope with it at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a common tool we might use in CBT, of kind of actually what's the likelihood and what is the worst case scenario, and could you cope? What would you do to cope if that were to happen? And that can bring, it starts to tune people into actually maybe they do have coping resources that they're not really paying attention to, and that worry just instantly pops into their head. That worry just becomes all consuming, and kind of the more sophisticated logical thinking kind of goes out the window. And so sometimes we need to purposely tune into the more sophisticated logical thinking. And again, that's an evolutionary thing. We're not meant to go think in really logical ways when we think we're under threat. We're just meant to get the hell out of there. So, we're actually having to train ourselves to do something that is not necessarily intrinsic for us. I think coming back to just what we're talking about, those positive beliefs that can drive worry, that I'll get something out of it, I'll be prepared and what have you. It can be really useful for people to compare, like, an example of a typical thing they'd worry about, and almost like write out the worry spiral, like what's the first negative thought, what's the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So they really get it all out there. And then contrast that with more a problem-solving thinking, like, okay, so what could I do about this, and what would be the first step, and when would I go about doing this? So, because I think what can often happen is people kind of confuse worrying for problem solving or productive planning. They think they're one and the same. They think all thinking's the same, but actually there's different types of thinking. And often when people do that, they can start to see, well, the repetitive negative thinking doesn't help at all, doesn't lead to anything productive. The problem-solving thinking, actually, that is quite helpful, and that does lead to something productive. And then my question would be, well, do you actually have to worry to do the problem-solving? Or can you just have a negative thought pop in your head, postpone it, and then come back to it later with more problem-solving thinking, rather than getting bogged down in the repetitive negative thinking? So I think, sometimes people have very strong positive beliefs that worry is helpful to them, but, in therapy, we'll kind of do lots of little exercises to try and maybe kind of challenge that idea that it really does help them. Is it the worrying that helps, or is it taking action? Is it problem solving? Are those the things that help, and do you necessarily have to worry to achieve those things?
Thank you for the hours worth of free therapy today, Lisa. I appreciated you solving all my problems.
It's a pleasure.
It's one less session I have to take to my own psychologist.
I'm glad I could be of assistance.
I do love my free therapy, Andy.
And it's not even Tuesday.
Or could be. That's the beauty of podcasts. It could be any day. Any day you're feeling trauma, feel free to put us on and call it Therapy Tuesday.
There you go.
So how about I drop some more trauma on you?
Yeah, let it rip.
Ready with the violins?
Look, I'll try and dig something up that's appropriate for that kind of mood, if you like.
I want to tell you about another significant depressive episode, because it does, for me, it's happened many, many times, and that kind of sucks.
Yeah, it does kind of suck.
It does kind of suck.
I mean, here you are in a successful career, and billboard worthy.
Oh, And
Sorry, I
yet,
didn't want to...
and yet without the billboard.
Without the billboard. But here you are in a successful career, and for anyone seeing you is going to go, oh, yeah, that's Louise on the radio. She's tops. Listen to her all the time. Love her happy voice.
Yeah.
Dun, 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 dun.
I worked in Newcastle for a while. It was as I was on my way up in my career after my first commercial radio job. Then I ended up in a job that if you were in the industry, you would have gone, hey, that's cool. That's a great step up. Well done. Little known fact about the industry, that is a very well-known fact that no one talks about. It doesn't pay very well, and they expect you to do a lot of work that they don't pay you for. When I was in Newcastle, I was doing a part-time job with full-time hours and part-time pay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because everyone needs to do work for the exposure and their resume, of course. You got to get the exposure, Andy.
Well, that's a common thing for anybody who is creative. Look, really love your work. Do you mind if I use it? I can give you great exposure on our Facebook page. We've got 200,000 followers. Everyone will love it.
Yeah. Yeah, but exposure doesn't pay the bills, that as the TikTok song says.
No.
But you're in those kind of situations. You believe that you've got to work your way up in a big company. At that stage, I was broke and I couldn't get another job because I was working full-time hours in a part-time pay. I'd moved away from a long-term relationship. We were still together, but we weren't in the same place. I didn't feel respected or valued there. Seems to be a thing, doesn't it?
Bit of a theme? Bit of a theme going on here?
Speaking of themes, it's always a shower.
Yep.
This time I was in the shower in Newcastle and I'm thinking, this is as bad as that other time.
Can I just say, probably not quite as bad because you weren't on tank water, probably.
That's true. This was it better or worse for the environment this way?
Either way, you felt exactly the same otherwise.
I'm so glad you could find the silver lining in this story.
Always.
But I'm there in the shower wondering what to do. I couldn't leave this career because I'd put my relationship on hold for it. It had to succeed. It is the beginnings of this career theme going on where I've got to keep with this career because this is the only thing that makes me happy. It's the only thing that will fix my depression. So if this job is not something that makes me happy, I guess then I just need another job. I don't need to fix the way I feel or look at anything like that. I just go get another job.
Wow. How many times have I moved on to another job feeling like that was going to fix everything?
I got offered the role of content director at Muswellbrook and said yes.
Woohoo! That must have felt amazing.
Except for the part where someone I was working with at the time told me that I'd never be good enough to be a metro radio announcer when I announced that I was leaving.
Really?
Yeah. The next day, they came back in and they said, oh, actually, I've had to think about it and you do have that potential. So maybe your next step could be like a large regional station.
Yeah, right. So overnight you've gone from
not good enough,
not good at all,
to maybe you'd be okay.
To, okay. What was it for them?
I assume they wouldn't have to train somebody else. Weekend passed, but by the next week, they popped in Monday morning and said, you've got potential to be metro. Let's make that your next stop.
It's amazing what a weekend will do.
Yeah, but I'd already resigned and accepted that other job. And so I went to Muswellbrook and then to Darwin as a content director.
That's where we met.
It is where we met.
Yeah.
And also, I think probably just after you left might have been another round of depression.
Ba, 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 ba.
In Darwin, I broke up with my partner. That partner that I had put on hold in Newcastle moved with me to Darwin, and then things went to Shitsville. I was also triggered by Ross River fever that I had, which caused significant pain. I still feel chronic pain. I just rarely ever talk about it now because no one ever wants to hear it. I was working probably 10-hour days. My relationship fell apart. I could barely get up the stairs sometimes because the pain that feels like arthritis was just so hard. I'd stop on the stairs, have a cry while my groceries were sitting next to me. And at that time, I not only did I think about self-harming, but I actually did do it a couple of times. I remember one point wanting to feel something other than the physical and emotional pain, and I stuck my hand on a hot plate.
Ow.
Not for very long. It was really fucking hot and really fucking hurt.
Yeah, that would.
But that was a I can't do this anymore moment.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, Darwin for me was an amazing opportunity. You know, you talk about that person who was saying, oh, it'll take you years to get here or years to get there, and what a great move that is. And when I got offered the role in Darwin, somebody in the industry said to me, that is an amazing offer, because I hadn't worked in commercial radio before. I was coming out of a course, essentially, late in life. And this person said to me, you've actually just cut 5 years out of your career. You've leapfrogged up into this amazing market. Congratulations. I was so happy.
And do you know why you did? Can I tell you why you did now? Because I did hire you all those years ago.
Yeah, go on. Tell me.
Because I always believed that you can teach someone skill, but you can't teach them attitude.
There you go.
And so I heard you, and I could see how I could improve your skill. But more importantly, I thought, he's a really good person.
Oh,
there you go.
That's the end of the episode. No. Darwin was a massive move for me. I was 37, and this is all at the end of that old episode we were talking about before with the breakup of the relationship and yada, yada, yada.
So this is around 2010, 2009?
2009.
Yeah.
So 2008 is when I was applying for the job. And so, it's a big thing for me. Like, my parents were in their 70s. I was starting to kind of feel like, should I stay? Should I go? All of that stuff that happens. But then, everything was pointing towards, this is an amazing opportunity. Just do it. Like, if you keep putting life off, then you're just going to get to the end of life and regret it. So I followed it. I took the job and it was great. But it was radio and, as you've said, long hours, little pay. So I was doing sometimes 13 to 16-hour days because it was radio. I loved it. And then 9 months into that gig, 3,000 Ks northwest of where I'd come from, my mum died. I remember it vividly. It was a Saturday morning. I went into the studio to do panel operating for an outside broadcast for a team that was doing an OB. And then I got a phone call partway through that to say that Dad had found her on the floor and that they were getting an ambulance and they were going to keep me updated. And then within about 2 minutes, I got the phone call and said, she's gone. Just thinking back to it now, I was paralysed behind that panel. I didn't know what to do. Like, I had lost, at that point, I completely lost all ability to make a decision. I couldn't even press the button to trigger the next break. And I could hear the guys on the other end of the headphones saying, are you there? What's going on? What's happening? What we need to go on now. And I was obviously lost for words.
Yeah.
Obviously, in shock, I went into depression, as you might expect, through the grief that I was experiencing. I had panic, I had anxiety. That was the first time in my life that I'd ever experienced a panic attack. So we had some pretty cool colleagues up there at the time, and one of them was my flatmate, and she was, and still is, such a go-getter. Everybody gave me my space and stuff, but there was a point where she said to me, look, why don't you come out, and I'm going to a barbecue, maybe it'll be nice to kind of get out and just relax a bit amongst other people and stuff, because I'd been kind of isolating a bit. So I said, yeah, okay, and I agreed to go. So we're on the way to this barbecue, and she said, look, I just need to pop into Woolies. Come in. I'm like, yeah, okay. So I went into Woolies, but then she bumped into a friend. And so they started having a chat.
And because I know exactly who you're talking about, she could chat to anyone about anything for any length of time.
Still can. I love her so much.
She's lovely.
But in the middle of Woolies, so here's me feeling like the 4-year-old child going, are we going yet? Are we going yet? Can we go now? Like, are we going? And like, she's having this conversation, kind of, I think, unaware of my internal state, because, you don't let that sort of thing show. So that conversation ended, walked up the next aisle, another friend. And so, like, another conversation started.
She's got a friend in every aisle.
Oh, my God, literally.
Yes.
But at that point, I just said to her, look, I really appreciate it. I can't do this. I've got to go. That's all I said. I've got to go. And she said, are you okay? I said, look, I don't know. No, not really. I just got to go. I've got to go. And I had to get out of that supermarket.
Yeah.
And I hot-footed it back to our place, because it was only down the road. And I think I might have actually stayed in my bedroom for about 4 days from that point. I could not face the world, Did I take medication?
I think we know the answer.
I think we know the answer to that. But what I did get that time around was I got to have a mental health plan because the stigma around that had significantly changed by the late noughties, as we call them.
Baby steps.
And so I at least got to have a mental health care plan put in place, and I got to access some counselling, which really was the saving grace in that situation for me. So, I mean, eventually I came to the decision that I needed to go and do something else. I needed to leave Darwin. Kind of led to me moving to Adelaide and working for a community station there and managing that. And there was a relationship that was forming at the same time with a guy in Adelaide, and we're still together. That all worked out. The radio job went years ago, but everything else kind of panned out really nicely. But, through all of that, the trademark pangs of imposter syndrome when I was working in that job that followed, even in Darwin, I had all of these things underlying that I just had never dealt with.
Yeah.
Then on top of this, now I had a widowed father who was now experiencing his own depressive episodes, and coupling that with his own threat of suicide.
I don't know if I told you that I tried to see a psychologist when I was in Darwin. Did I tell you that I tried to see a psychologist?
No.
I think I might have actually gone and gotten the referral for, at that stage, 6 sessions.
Mm-hmm.
And this dude, I did 1 session with him, and I felt like I was a Medicare paycheck, and I was just there to tap my card so he got his little rebate and my money. It was just open up your wallet, girls.
Ka-ching!
I didn't feel like he listened, and he gave me a CD that he'd copied at the end of it and said, "There's a meditation on here, just go do this."
Wow. That's what Medicare bought you in those days,
That's what Medicare bought me in, this is after you left, so...
Yeah, right.
20,
I got lucky.
2011, that's what Medicare bought me. I never went back to see that person, and I didn't go back to another psychologist until my current one because of my experience with him.
Yeah, I think that highlights the importance of actually, if you have a bad experience with a professional like that, don't give up.
No, don't give up.
Because, like any relationship, there's going to be one that fits. I think it's important to keep that in mind, like even the stuff that my family and I were going through with Dad after Mum passed away. Like I travelled back to Sydney at one point after he'd been admitted to hospital, on one of the occasions he'd been admitted. And it wasn't long after this all happened, so it was all still very raw. And I remember him looking at me from his hospital bed and telling me that he was going to kill himself. And I knew enough around some of the questions to ask by that point to safely kind of explore what he meant by that and, all that kind of stuff. And he said, well, look, I know how I'm going to do it. No one will know until it's happened. And you can imagine, like, in the middle of grief there over Mum, having now my other parents saying he intends to actually end his own life. So I rang a helpline to get some help and some advice. And they went, oh, no, he doesn't really sound like he's a high risk. And then the hospital, and I mentioned it to some people at the hospital, and
It's
they
not
were of the
funny.
same opinion. No, it's not. It's just like, but he doesn't sound like he's actually going to do it. And then he ended up getting discharged into my care, so it is my responsibility on discharge from hospital. So there's some extra from the psychological burden cake to pile on there. And then amongst all of that, I was leaving this radio job, so I was sad that I just hadn't been able to cut it in the industry. I fell back into call centre work. That was the thing that kind of felt safe for me. I think, over the years, I've kind of looked for things in my comfort zone to go, okay, well, that was a bit of a stretch. Maybe I can just come back and do this. And as the pattern goes, like in Darwin, I got recognised for my leadership skills, got promoted, took the promotion because it made me feel valued. That's all part of a big pattern for me. That's something where, I would look for my own self-value in terms of external factors. And I suppose, if anything, this journey that we've taken in making this podcast so far and what will continue to unfold is that I'm learning ways to not do that, to actually legitimately find value in myself, not just as a platitude, not just to say, oh, I'm worth it, or, I am good enough. It's, well, show me the bloody evidence. You know what I mean? Because I'm an evidence-based person. So now I'm learning how to actually give that to myself.
At that time, after you left Darwin, and it was my turn to get depressed there, the way that I got myself out of that was a little bit of the original pattern of running to something else. But I did an interview with someone, and they said to me, oh, we're running a course, a telephone counselling course. Do you want to do it? And I said, yeah, okay, I had nothing else to do with my time. And I did that course. And I think actually looking at it, it's very rudimentary. I mean, it's rudimentary even compared to this podcast. But looking at some of those concepts that were in there kind of helped me to see some of those patterns in myself. And it also included, as a part of that, something called ASSIST. I don't know if it's still called ASSIST, but it's an acronym for basically a risk assessment for people who are feeling suicidal. And I obviously took my risk assessment myself, and that wasn't good. But learning some of those skills, learning some of those resilience techniques was enough to help me at that stage. And knowing that stuff, that ASSIST stuff, one day not before I left Darwin, one of the staff from a different department actually came and sat with me and told me how they were feeling and that they were feeling suicidal. And I was able to go through stuff with them and make a contract, make a plan for them to come back and talk to me. And yeah, those skills that I learned that helped me, I mean, I really hope helped her as well in that. Those little skills that help us build resilience.
Yeah. Like life really has a tendency to throw things often quite randomly at us, I mean, yes. Who would have thought 3 years ago that would be at this point of a pandemic? Yeah, having been through lockdowns and everything that we've been through. And I know that Kimberley Norris actually has some really good stuff with regard to that. And we had a bit of a chat to her about the correlation between what she found with lockdowns and her studies of people who are living in Antarctica.
Whilst there are parallels, there is one very important difference that you've already alluded to, and that's the fact that people who live and work in Antarctica do so voluntarily. So they actually have a degree of choice over this. Because there is that choice element, more often than not, they've actually spent many months, if not even years, preparing for that time away. So they've had a lot of time to work on their own mental health and well-being, to reflect on their goals and their priorities while they're down there, and to plan what they intend to do with any downtime they might have. In contrast, people who are experiencing enforced lockdowns, and particularly somewhat unexpected lockdowns, are faced with a much more unpredictable situation. And so in terms of the best strategies we can draw based on other populations, based on research we've conducted with people who have similar but not the same experiences, are these. The first being, and I recognise it is so much easier to say than do this, but it's taking control over things that we can and letting go of control over things that we can't. So when I talk about taking control, what I mean is within the things that remain under your, we call it the sphere of influence. So things that you can directly influence the outcome of, make choices. So make a decision about what you might choose to do during this time. Have a sense of achievement built into that. So build smaller goals, ideally that are really personally meaningful to you, so they align with your value system, they have that sense of purpose, and when you achieve them, recognising that sense of achievement. Because when we talk about this thing called resilience, and I recognise that's a word that gets thrown around a lot now, but essentially, regardless of what you mean by resilience, whether you think it's the ability to cope with challenges, whether you think it's the ability to bounce back after challenges, what we do know is that people who have an understanding, appreciation, or acceptance that their experience both served a purpose but also had meaning. So there was a sense of purpose and meaning. These are the people who are most likely to be resilient. So rather than focusing on the loss of what I can't do, if we can focus on what we can do, that actually allows for a sense of achievement, purpose, meaning, and better coping as a result.
It kind of feels like in that scenario, maybe we need to take a step back and learn to appreciate what we've been gifted, if we've been gifted something way above what we're used to.
Absolutely. And taking that step back, acknowledging, appreciating, and if possible, reflecting on, given this was a gift, given this was something that was unexpected, how can that help me to achieve more meaning in my life? And that might be through directly doing things focused on yourself, or it might be by supporting and helping others. But the idea is seeing it not as the end point, but as the next step towards your next goal.
I think when I win the lotto, I'm going to be much happier, Kimberley. That's great advice.
And the money might not make us happy, but it's going to get us some more Uber Eats, and we love that.
Definitely.
That's exactly right. But again, it's the first step of the next activity.
That's right. Mind you, I have to start playing first, but go on.
Are there any other, like when people go to places like Antarctica and then they have really isolating jobs, and you said that they actually do a lot of mentally preparing before they do that.
Yes.
Is there anything else we can kind of pull out of their toolkit of what they pre-plan for that we can use ourselves?
So the Antarctic expeditioners who adapt most effectively and are able to weather the challenges that extreme environment poses to them are those that actually have goals. So they're not just there to do their job, which obviously is a goal in and of itself and is what driven them there, but they also have side goals. So it's very, very common for expeditioners to give themselves that time to learn a new language or to learn a new skill. And the carpenters are often inundated with people wanting to come into the workshop and learn how to use various tools and create things. Some people create a video or a photographic blog or use it as a chance to share Antarctica with the world, bearing in mind most people will never get there. But essentially people who are able to create opportunities for achievement and accept that achievement. The other thing too is that the Australian Antarctic program has understood the importance of goals, achievements and communal social activities for a really long time in terms of how it's so vital for mental health and well-being. And so there'll be things like they have the Antarctic Tour de France where they'll be on exercise bikes doing the Tour de France and having competitions between the various stations about who can win this leg. They have video competitions where each station creates a video and they're all then judged. They have dart competitions between the stations. So friendly competition creates that sense of achievement, it creates opportunities for practice and positive social interaction. And all of those things help with resilience.
I imagine in that kind of environment, there's also the opportunity for personality traits to be very much highlighted. I'm thinking in a general sense around cleanliness around the kitchen and the signs that pop up in staff rooms.
I will be honest with you, in Antarctica there's nowhere to hide. But of course there's very, very extensive screening procedures that happen before people are selected to work in that environment because of the understanding of the impacts of those things. But also, you know, there are incredible people who work there, who live there, and so kitchen isn't such an issue because there is slushy duty. Now, slushy is the person or the people who support the chef for a given meal service, and they are amazing kitchen hands, and they will do the work of helping the chef set up, to provide the food on time, to clean up as well. And their reward is Slushy's choice of radio or music station. So there's an incentive for them there. But generally speaking, what you do find is towards the end of an Antarctic stay, over a winter period at least, so it's been a lot longer and the challenges have been more extreme given, you know, almost total darkness and those types of things for a period of time, is that people tend to withdraw more. So they pull away more because they're using their energy to, if you like, just keep their head above water and to be able to maintain those civil relationships with people who, you know, that they're living, working, eating, socialising with 24/7. So what it does mean is that people who are really highly extroverted and have that strong need for social novelty probably are going to find it harder in Antarctica because most people actually do need some time on their own to put that energy back in. So generally speaking, we do find people with moderate to lower levels of extroversion do well in that environment.
Do you think it could be linked to that idea of re-emergence after isolation from an activity like that and the re-emergence from a depressive episode?
There are definite parallels most definitely there are parallels there. There are similar challenges, and also that idea, as you say, that depression isn't something that switches on and off. It is a gradual thing, and people will start to slowly start to feel that things are getting a little bit better, and they're getting closer to what is normal for them. But that idea of time is so vital. And again, it's relevant to people who are currently experiencing lockdowns across the globe. That just because the lockdown's over, just because your depressive symptoms are starting to decline, just because you've left Antarctica, doesn't mean everything's easy. In fact, it means you've started the next stage of challenge, and one that across the board is really underestimated, and that actually makes us most vulnerable at that time because we don't expect how hard it's going to be.
When you kind of come out of that depressive phase and you start to feel those glimmers of, okay, maybe it doesn't always feel like this, maybe there are some more positive emotions to have. I mean, I know I feel fearful that that depressive phase is going to start again, or also judgmental that I haven't reached more consistently those positive emotions.
And of course, that's the really hard part of when you're starting to come out of a depressive episode, but you're still very impacted by it. You still have a lot of that negative self-talk that really just wants to pull you back down there and keep you, nice and uncomfortable in that depressive phase. And what it is about is recognizing again that idea of, rather than focusing on what you didn't do or where you're not yet, focus on where you are. And like you said, so those little glimmers, or those little patches of time where you go, wow, things are a bit better or could be better. Trying to hold on to that and saying, that's proof that I have achieved something. That's proof that I am emerging on this other side. And it's proof that each time I have a depressive episode, I probably learn something more. Learn something more about myself. Learn something more about what helps versus what hurts me during these times. But the big thing to learn across the board is self-compassion. We need to be kind to ourselves, because that kindness also helps an increased likelihood of positive emotional experience.
Can we call this one our post-depressive growth?
Absolutely. Let's coin it. Let's trademark it.
It seems to me that evidence plays a big part in that reframe, but also it could also be very useful in, I guess, fighting those demons. When your little voice is telling you one thing, then if you ask it for evidence, whether it can actually provide that or not, would it be capable of doing that? Or is it just normally working at that level where it's just telling you you're no good?
It depends on when you catch it. If you catch it early enough, and this is why often the work that people will do with their mental health professionals, whether it be a psychologist or someone else, is that we actually teach people to learn their early warning signs. Because if you learn your early warning signs, your ability to do that very thing, to challenge those negative thoughts, to redirect energies, to redirect thinking and emotions, is much more likely to be successful. However, once you reach a certain phase or depth of, and we're using depressive episodes as an example, but it does apply across the board, once you reach a certain depth, then that, if you like, that rational thinking, even if you know, and I'll have clients of my own say to me, I know logically that's true, but I don't believe it right now.
Yeah.
And that's the difficulty, that once you've gone a little bit too far down that slippery slope, you can logically see the reality and what would help, but your ability to engage that, and remember your brain's ability, because of neurochemical imbalances, it won't be able to do so as effectively.
What's happening within the brain at that point to prevent that from happening? Is it, I think you've just touched on it there, it sounds like more like a neurochemical pathway that's been activated and perhaps let go on a bit too long? Is that a bit of a layman's explanation? Or
I think that's a really nice and simple summary of what happens. Essentially, when people are experiencing true mental health episodes, whether that be a depressive episode, whether it be around anxiety, whether it be whatever condition of somebody is trying to manage, essentially you reach a tipping point. So in the early, those early warning sign phases, you are getting a little bit of a chemical imbalance happening. You're getting a behavioural imbalance happening as well, because remember, even neurochemically and behaviourally, they work very much in tandem. But you still have if you like, a window to right the ship, to try and balance things back out. However, once that has been going on for some time, and it might have been without awareness, or it might have been despite awareness and despite efforts to the contrary, it does reach that tipping point where the neurochemicals in the brain are not working to your advantage. They are actually driving the various messages going throughout your body, and they do influence your behaviour. Even, and it might seem simple, but even in terms of you're going to become more lethargic. And if you're more lethargic, you're going to do less. And if you do less, then you're going to beat yourself up for not having done as much. And so suddenly the brain and the body, so the thought and the behaviour, are actually keeping you in that cycle.
Can relate to all of that, Kimberley.
Yeah. Well, it's really the mirror of what we've been talking about earlier in the conversation, isn't it? We're trying to, and what people like yourself are learning about at the moment, in being able to try and reframe the other side of that question, and to see, well, okay, if this is happening in a downward phase, then how can we make use of it in an upward phase instead?
Absolutely. And when you're coming back out, when you're having that post-depressive growth, then what you're finding is, okay, so as I'm coming out, what is it that's helping me? What's helping me come out? Even if I'm finding it challenging, what's helping me on that pathway? Because that's where, for me, and again, all biases coming to the fore, for me as a psychologist, that's the excitement, that we're not talking about a one-size-fits-all. What we're talking about is, here are some overarching principles informed by research and evidence that we can then personalise to your experience and use your experience to maximise your well-being.
And I think the importance of, I suppose, checking on our own feelings, our own mental health every day, it's can't be understated, because it's very easy for that momentum to slip out from underneath you, and then you're down the slippery slope.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things, again, that I think we've got a really exciting opportunity to culturally make a really important shift. For example, if your finger was bleeding and it was just bleeding constantly, started as a drip, then you'd probably do something about it. You wouldn't wait till it was gushing to do something about it. Yet often that's what we do with our mental health. That'll be fine, I'll get over it, until we can't. It takes so much more effort and energy to come back out of the hole than to try and get it early.
I think one of the more useful things that I've actually employed over the last 12 months or so, I lost my father around about this time last year, and in the period since, every morning I've been journaling. In fact, through the event itself, I was journaling because I felt at the time I wanted something to look back on after I was through the period of grief, to see what my journey was through that. But I've also found that from day to day, if I'm starting to feel low, or if I wake up feeling low in any way, by the time I've written out how I'm feeling, I find a solution and can get myself back on the pathway to happiness.
And there's a couple of things happening right there when you do those types of activities. Number one, you're investing in yourself. You are recognising your value and putting energy into yourself. Number two, you're actually making time to process your feelings. So it's not just letting them be there and do what they want to do. You're making sense of them. And even more, the reason we do find that some people in particular benefit from things like journaling is then you're not just thinking about it, you're writing about it. And what we know is that the more sensory systems you engage when you're thinking, the more deeply you process the information, and then the more effect it's going to have. So that's why we do talk about things like journaling or talking, not just thinking, because the number of times I'll be speaking to a client and I'll get them to write it down, or I'll say, well, talk me through it. And they literally have this aha moment, and they'll stop because suddenly things have started to come together, and all that's changed is they're getting it out of their brain and into the world.
Andy and I had a similar conversation the other week about why I take so many handwritten notes, because he remembers and works really well when he's typing onto a computer to process his information, but I find that kind of goes straight back out my brain. But I'll write notes for our interviews down on pages and pages and pages, and even though I can't really read my writing anymore, it seems to stick better.
It does, and it is that process of multiple sensory systems all receiving the same information. Therefore, you're activating multiple parts of the brain, which then processes it much more deeply, and because it processes it more deeply, then you embed the memory more appropriately, and you can retrieve it more easily.
Can we find the one that works for us? Like, is there a technique to find that individually which one is going to be our best bet?
People are going to think I'm such a nerd, but the exciting thing for me is trial and error. Try them all. Even if you think you know what works for you, give something else a try. Give it a good try. Give it at least a couple of goes, because, like anything, when it's new, it won't always fit. But the idea is the more strategies you have, then the more options you have if you feel one's just not working for you.
And as a matter of fact, as soon as Louise mentioned to me her handwritten technique, I didn't start writing questions out myself on the paper. I still refer to my screen, but I sit here during interviews and I'm very glad they're not on Zoom, because I'm doodling and I'm making notes as I go. Yeah. And I actually feel more engaged with the conversation.
Exactly. And that's it. It's about giving ourselves permission to explore what works for us, and then make the most of it.
I was laughed at once in a training session because I kept drawing aliens, but that's another story.
Kimberley, what are your values? Is that too personal to ask?
No, listen, I'm very, very happy. And obviously I have the privilege of the training I do, and so have had lots of opportunities and continue to reflect on my values. So my values primarily stem from a belief that all people are worthy and all people are therefore needing and should have ready access to whatever needs and resources are available to live the most personally fulfilling life for them. And that fulfillment is defined by them and for them. It's not my job to identify what's fulfilling or what's right for anybody else. And similarly, another value for me is to appreciate everything that I have, whether that be achievements, whether that be the important people in my life, whether that be my chickens, whatever it might be, but really giving myself permission to be in the moment, because you'll never have that moment again. So what I find from those core values is I have a range of other values. So you can see how much time I've spent on this. I have my base values, then I have my second order values, and on and on and on we go.
I can already see the infographic appearing in my head.
Exactly, and I do. I have it visualised. But for me, they're the ones that fundamentally every person is so very worthy and so very valuable. And so that shapes the way I think, that shapes the way I act, and it shapes why I do what I do, whether it be in my research sphere, whether it be in my teaching and training sphere, whether it be in my clinical psychology sphere. It's all designed to maximise human health, well-being and performance.
Do you try and make every decision with those in mind?
Absolutely.
Even the small decisions?
Even the small decisions. Obviously, I won't spend as much time or energy, and remembering I've been doing this for so long that my values are so front and centre with everything that I don't have to dig down for them. So it's become much more automatic. But absolutely, my decisions, and even in terms of I am in a position where I'm able to make choices around, for example, foods that don't always have to be driven by cost. So I will look at foods that are supporting people supporting traditional owners of lands, of First Nations peoples, of Indigenous peoples, to help them reclaim their rights. I will make decisions on food that engage in positive work behaviour policies, those types of things. So it might seem small, but every small action from every person can make such an incredible difference.
I love talking to you, Kimberley.
I love talking to you both as well.
We're going to have an amazing dinner party one time.
Absolutely.
Both times I've walked away from this feeling like you're just the loveliest person, and we're so glad we found you.
Oh, thank you. That's very, very lovely feedback. But for me, I'm thankful that you reached out, because this, for me, it aligns with my values, and being able to share what knowledge I have that could possibly help anybody else. That's so exciting and such a privilege.
Hopefully we can have another chat again in the future.
Sounds like a good plan to me. I look forward to it.
Some really good strategies there from Kimberley. And, I think what we've explored here is that there are options. There are plenty of options and places for help that we can go to. I guess I'm curious, though, what is it that made you decide in the end that medication was the pathway that you needed to take?
After I said no medication for all those earlier times, like you did.
Yeah.
It was actually because, it's not because I was feeling suicidal, because I have felt suicidal a lot of times in my life. It was actually because I started feeling homicidal. I would hear someone, and I really hope nothing here is going to identify anybody, because it's not a reflection on this person. But there was somebody who had a laugh, and when they would laugh, it would shred through me like nails down a chalkboard, and there's nothing wrong with their laugh. Realised it was going through my mind one day, what could I do to stop them laughing? And that's not an okay reaction.
That doesn't sound very healthy.
That's not a healthy reaction. And
No.
not on them at all. They should be allowed to laugh at things that are funny.
Yeah, without the risk of being topped off for it.
And so that's why when the doctor said, do you want to try medication? I said yes, because I'm used to feeling suicidal, but I don't want to feel like I'm going to hurt anybody else. I never want to hurt anybody else. Have you, I know we've spoken about...
Have I ever wanted to kill somebody?
No, I know we've spoke about depression in here, but have you ever felt like suicide?
Yeah, I have. I'm not depressed now, and I don't think about ending my life now, and I haven't for many, many years. But, some years back, I did actually consider the possibility that was an option. And I did some research, and I looked at a way that I could do that, and that really scared me.
Yeah, it's terrifying, isn't it?
It scared me to think that I could be in a place where I felt like I just had no value and I had no hope, and that option was the best option to resolve it.
Yeah.
The thing that stopped me from doing that is the feeling that I got about how it would affect people who are close to me, who do love me. That's essentially what stopped me from doing it, really.
One of the things that was in that assist course I was talking about is they said that if you do meet someone who wants to do that, then try to distract them with something that they want to live for. And number one thing is often pets.
Yeah, pets definitely something that came to mind. How would my little cat feel if I wasn't there to feed it on that day, or snuggle in with it in front of the telly, or really that really is a good call, because that is definitely one of the things that contributed to me stepping away from that thought.
Yeah.
Still unmedicated. Don't read the medication.
Of course.
Nope, not going to get any of that.
Pets is up there for me too, a lot of those times I thought, well, I can't do this because who's going to feed the cats?
Exactly. And, our bodies will only last so long for them to get a meal out of.
I'm sure that Cat Stevens would love to have a chew, but...
Oh, my God, yes. We joke about these things and it's dark humour, but, it's a very serious thing as well. And I think if anybody is listening to us now, we're not actually making light of this subject matter. And if you're feeling like this, or someone who is, definitely we've got resources or links to resources in our show notes so that you can access them and get the help that's needed. But there are times in life where we just feel like that we can't cope, and it's just all too much. 10 years after Mum died, we lost Dad. It was almost 10 years to the day. But that's the point where I feel that this is probably a term that isn't familiar with a lot of people, but there's a term called family of orientation. And I only know that term because I looked it up, because I thought, there's just something here that's different to what my siblings are experiencing in the sense of family and what I'm experiencing. And what it is that, for anybody who has children, they then create their own family of procreation. So that's the continued branch of the family tree. For someone like me who hasn't procreated, it's me and my partner, or if I had been single, it would have been me. So the family of orientation that I stemmed from, that's the term that I looked up. The family of orientation, that's, where you begin. That's where you have your parents, if you're lucky enough to have parents. Some people, there are all sorts of permutations in family, and what we get so often is this Hollywood version of the perfect family. You know, it's the Christmas movie where everybody comes home for Christmas and everything's perfect. You know, all of these happy family get-together films, they feel good and people have their problems, but then it's all resolved by the third act and everybody goes on living happily. It doesn't happen. It's not that clean. Yeah, I mean, I really love my family, but at that point where Dad passed away, I really felt like my family fell apart at the seams. My brothers each have their own families, and I think what I also noticed within myself as well is that some of the ways that I was acting and some of the things that I was observing across my family were patterns of behaviour that had been going on for generations. You know, it wasn't particular to us. It wasn't even particular to our parents' generation, but I'm seeing things and hearing things that I heard my grandmother saying. Yep. Yeah, and these are things that go on intergenerationally. I really felt like I had to do things differently. You know, I was at that point in the job at the bank. I felt like an imposter. That was about to end. When money came through from Dad's estate, I thought, okay, well, the reality is this is an opportunity for me to kind of take a bit of a step back and have a bloody good look at myself. As one of them told me, you know, like maybe I can start my own business. Maybe I can actually distance myself somewhat where I need to and break away from those well-worn family patterns and try, at least for myself, to do it differently. But if I can even inspire someone else to break their own family patterns and actually do things their way, whether it's within my own family or somebody else in their own circumstances, you know, I think it's kind of how we sometimes live in autopilot without realizing it. You know, we go through these traditions, we go through all of these times, then suddenly when what you expect isn't there anymore, what next?
My pattern has been expecting something outside of myself to be the thing that fixes my mental health. That I can make my depression go away, that I can make my anxiety go away if I just do this thing, if I have this thing, if this thing changes for me, if I have a new job, if I have a new city, if I have a new relationship. And none of that is true. But depression...
Because you know why?
Go.
It's because wherever you go, there you are.
Yeah. My depression is never going to be cured, ever. And I've got to say there is immense power in knowing that. Instead of looking for an ending to it, oh, happy day, actually going, no, I have the resources and tools within myself to deal with this the next time it comes up. I can be realistic and say, yeah, you know what? This is not the last time I'm going to feel that way. Next time I know what to do, and I'll always know what to do.
What you're describing there is, you know, what we often hear just as the tip of the platitude iceberg.
Yeah.
That's where your power is. You know, you're backing yourself. But there's a whole lot under the surface there that is supporting that before you even get to be able to say that statement.
And that statement, again, comes from today where I don't feel depressed. But, you know, I felt depressed last week. I had a day last week where something happened. Maybe we'll save it for season 2. It's a whole new lot of trauma.
It's all about distance. Get the distance.
Where something happened and it was immensely overwhelming, and I sat on the floor of the shower until the hot water ran out. And I thought, I don't know how I can deal with this anymore. I don't know what to do. Should I just give up? But also in that moment, after the hot water ran out, I was like, you know what, I'm going to get back up. And I've learned things in this series, and in my 40 years of life, I've learned tools. This is temporary. This feeling is temporary. I have within me the skills to work with this, and it's not going to feel this way in a week, in a month, in a year. It might still feel this way tomorrow, actually, but it might not. So it's not going to be cured, but it can be managed and it can be acknowledged, and I can live with that, and that's okay, because it's all okay. And the more we talk about it, the easier it is for everybody. And that's our sad episode on depression.
Woo!
But it is important to get it out of the way, though, because I don't think we can do a series on mental health and finding tools that will help us feel better if we don't acknowledge that sometimes things are just shit and you can't stick a platitude over it and have it go away. It's an illness. It comes back.
No, that's right. And, you know, I think equally as well, it's not just about popping a pill to make it better. Like, there's a lot of things out there that are available that work in conjunction. And any one of these things might be the thing that works, but there could be a lot out there that doesn't as well. And, the important thing is that we just keep backing ourselves and trying and knowing that it's completely okay. If you're having a shit day and you don't want to deal with the world, then,
it's okay to go back to bed.
Yep.
It's also okay to take your pain and trauma and use it to start a business. Or a podcast, or both.
Or any number of those things.
And that is where we're up to on this journey. So next time on Reframe of Mind,
we speak to the lovely Daphne Kapitas, who is the CEO of La Joie Skincare Pty Limited, and of the value in backing yourself and speaking your truth.
I don't allow myself to be consumed by my environment. In terms of in my industry, I never felt that I was less than a male. I never got paid less than a male, but I made sure that I was valued.
If you are concerned about yourself or someone you know, please seek professional advice and support. You can contact Beyond Blue on 1300 224 636 or at beyondblue.org.au.
Or you can contact Lifeline on 131114 or at lifeline.org.au. We'd like to thank today's guests for sharing their personal stories and insights, and for more information on any of the subjects, guests or references used in this episode, please see our show notes or reframeofmind.com.au.
Reframe of Mind is a Welcome Change Media production.